Yeah, the Black Panthers, how they fought the state. I think to start off by saying that Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, to give them their full name, were childhood heroes, I guess you could say. They didn't really last long, only for a few years really, in terms of their heyday, from the mid-60s until the early 70s. But in that short space of time, they left their stamp and a legacy that lives on today, from the likes of Beyonce and her, people saw the Formation album and the things she did at a football match, what do they call them again, bowl, the Super Bowl thing, which was a big homage to the Black Panther parties, at least to their styling, if not their revolutionary socialist politics. And even today, the Not Fucking Around Coalition, to give them their full name, the NFAC, which is a black nationalist, I guess you'd say, black liberation, because the word nationalist is somewhat besmirched, used in that way. But anyway, who look to the Panthers in terms of an argument about self-defense. They don't have any of the rest of the politics of the Black Panther Party, but they are dressed in black and they do have lots of guns, probably a lot more guns than the Black Panther Party ever had. So the tradition lives on in that sense as well, we might say. Yeah, so where did the Black Panther Party come from? Very quickly, an outgrowth of what was going on in the wider movement. How the civil rights movement in America, which exploded in the mid-50s and was ticking loudly ever since the Second World War, when people came back, black GIs, and found exactly the same situation of racial oppression as existed before, after just fighting a war against racism and fascism, discovering, well, not discovering, but realizing that, of course, it was still very much homegrown, the racism bit. And of course, people know the history of the civil rights movement, but how that grew into the Black liberation movement or the Black power movement, but fundamentally how the politics shifted as people looked for more effective ways to fight and win the battle against systemic racism in the US. So a shift from mobilizing the masses, because it was a mass movement, the civil rights movement, from right across the South and encompassing all classes of black people, led by the black middle class and with white allies, with tens of thousands of white allies and students who came down south on the freedom rides and so on, who were brutally attacked. But this non-violent movement actually depended in a perverse way on those violent attacks, in the sense of that shamed the US state in the eyes of the world and forced them to have to introduce the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. But in response to that rising violence, increasing numbers of black activists and others, but black activists said, well, actually enough with turning the other cheek. Self-defense is no offense. And a man called Malcolm X preached that message. And he preached it so vociferously, he was kicked out of the Nation of Islam, to be frank. He was probably killed by the Nation of Islam or some of its followers, who were allowed to do it by the police because it got rid of a very dangerous man in their eyes. And so you could say the Black Panther Party were the inheritors of the ideas of Malcolm X, and as far as Malcolm stood for black liberation by any means necessary. The Panthers wanted to take that on and give it real meaning, because obviously Malcolm didn't have time to build his Organisation of African American Unity. And also, I haven't got time to go into it, but how Malcolm's ideas shifted with the struggle from black separatism towards an idea that actually racism is to do with systems, it's a social product of a society, as opposed to something that just leaps out of the heads of white people, something to do with the way capitalism, and that's the word that he used, operated, and you couldn't have racism without capitalism. The Panthers took that on board. As I say, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, to give them their name, arose in 1965 on the west coast of the United States, and they were acutely aware of all of those battles against Jim Crow, the legal segregation of the South. Didn't really apply up north because you didn't have the legal segregation, but you had de facto segregation. It still existed, but not with a law saying only white people can drink here or sit here to eat and so But instead, you had massively segregated housing. You had a whole load of black ghettos in every single major city where black people were forced to live, and they didn't live there by choice because they lived there because they couldn't find anywhere else to live. And you had the worst housing, the worst education, the worst services, and on top of that, you had systemic police brutality. So it wasn't by accident then, but the Black Panthers saw fighting back most effectively and winning support by confronting the police doing the brutalizing. And as I say, the civil rights movement grew into the Black Power movement, and that the backbone of that was urban insurrections that shook America from the mid-60s onwards, culminating most massively in 1968 when they murdered Martin Luther King Jr. That was the backdrop to the Black Panther Party, and they said Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the founders, talked about their first strategy would be to patrol the pigs, to use their phrase, pigs being the police, the pejorative for the police at that time. And they did that very effectively with a shotgun in one hand and a law book with people's rights in the other, and would patrol the police and watch what they were doing. They didn't go into armed confrontation with them, but they made it known that they had their shotgun. And as people should be aware, in the UK, there's an argument about this, but every American citizen has a right to bear arms to defend the Republic from tyrants, which personally I think is quite a good democratic demand, but it can be abused, obviously. But anyway, black people were not allowed to exercise that right. They had it in law, but in practice, especially in the South, it was quite difficult to exercise. So the Black Panthers said, we're going to exercise our right to bear arms. And that's what they did. And there was an attempt in the city council of the state capital of California, a place called Sacramento, where the Capitol sits, that building. And there was the politicians were trying to weaken aspects of that law so you couldn't bear arms in public or concealed weapons and so on. So anyway, the Panthers said, this is our opportunity to go up there and actually say that, no, we are going to defend our right to bear arms. And so they put on their uniforms of black berets and black leather jackets and so on, people will be familiar with, and got their shotguns and marched up in sort of semi-formation as an armed group or an armed militia, and appeared on the Capitol steps of the capital, of the Sacramento, California capital. And that went viral across the United States. And viral then just meant for network TV, but that's what everybody watched. And within hours, the whole of America was talking about who are these Black Panther people, and especially in those big urban cities and ghettos, the black ghettos, people were saying, wow, who the hell are they? This Black Panther Party. And so who were they? They were rooted in Marxist politics. They described themselves as Marxists. They described themselves as revolutionaries, and they described themselves as socialists. What exactly was the nature of their politics, and how did they try to put their Marxism and their socialism and their revolutionary politics into practice? Okay, well, their Marxism was radically different to ours. When I say ours, I mean the Socialist Workers' Party, which comrades are maybe not familiar with, but roughly speaking, we would argue that exploited in society are the working class people, you and me, that have to force to anything we've got of making a living is by going to work for the capitalists, because we don't have any land, we don't have our own independent tools and stuff. We've taken all the means of production off us to a long period, which I haven't got time to go into. So we were forced to work for them. And the people that make all the money are the ones at the top, the minority. So working people, not because they smell nice or something, but because of their class position, are forced to come together. The black people amongst the working class, the gay people amongst the working class, the white people among the working class are forced to come together in order to actually fight most effectively. To the extent we don't do that, we lose. And there are other reasons why we lose also, but that is one of the key ones, and the capitalists know this very well. So working people have an interest, we would argue, in fighting and overcoming divisions and oppressions that affect our side, be it sexism, racism, and homophobia, and any other forms of oppression. And so we root that in where there is power. and we argue for working people, you and me, to use our economic power to paralyze their system and to wield that economic power for political ends, to smash their state and to take their power and expropriate their wealth for the democratic interests of distributing the fruits of our labour. The Panthers saw it differently and said that, and they weren't that different to many others of the so-called New Left that arose in the 60s, who didn't like what they saw in Russia, had a more genuine approach, I would say, to Marxism, and it's where we came from in the 60s, with a critique of what was going on in Russia. But to them, it wasn't just for the industrial working class was an issue, and it wasn't just them that argued this. They said that basically working class people were, especially in the West, were increasingly being bought off. We hear this today as well, that we've got too many mortgages and stuff, and people too much of a stake in the system, therefore people aren't going to go on strike. Well, this is a rehash of an old argument in the 60s. There was too much borrowing, there's too much HP, hire purchase things, where you can go and get something from a shop on tick, borrowings and stuff. People had too much stake in the system, so they're never going to make a revolution, as Marx had envisaged. More than that, actually, the focus of where the revolution would begin and where it would have most support, well, actually probably wouldn't be in the West. It would be in the colonial struggles, the anti-colonial struggles that were sweeping the world at this time. And so if Russia didn't look like a good place, China looked better. Because China, they were having a cultural revolution, which the Panthers and others in the West didn't quite realize was killing millions of people, but never mind. The Red Guards looked like they were doing something constructive. The anti-colonial struggles, as I say, were taking root and were succeeding across Africa and elsewhere, notably in terms of the American context, Vietnam. So that kind of idea seemed like a better way to fight. And so they transported those sorts of ideas, Maoism, essentially, into their movement in the States. But the problem with it is Maoism and the guerrilla struggle that underpinned it, or say, for example, Mao could build an army, peasant army led by a middle class, people like him, against imperialists, and they could win, and they did, and they unified China. But it wasn't a socialist revolution, it was a national revolution, but we still support it against the West, obviously. And same with all these other national struggles. And in terms of the guerrilla aspect of it, struggles like in Nkrumah in Ghana didn't depend on the guerrilla warfare. They didn't need guerrilla warfare, they just needed to paralyze the state in Ghana, which they did successfully through general strikes, through uprisings, through demonstrations, through organizing in a trade union, through making the imposition of British imperial rule untenable. Elsewhere, guerrilla warfare was used, still continues in some parts of the world to this day, from the Naxalites in India to the FARC in Colombia, who I think have made a peace agreement, but they fought for what, several decades without the state being able to stop them. Let's not go into all the issues of them, but basically you could do that in the countryside and launch attacks from the countryside, and the state couldn't get you. In the United States of America, the most important capitalist, the most advanced capitalist country in the world, you couldn't do that. But anyway, so they took that idea and said that the black people in America were an internal colony of the United States. They didn't literally mean to take a guerrilla struggle to the American state, but they conceived of the struggle in that way. And who were the people who were the shock troops? Wouldn't be necessarily guerrilla fighters, but the shock troops would be what they called, the Panthers called the brothers on the block, which were the shock troops of urban insurrections we talked about that started in the mid-60s. And these are huge struggles. They talk about riots at the moment, or the Black Lives Matter riots. There haven't been any riots. You want to see a riot? Check out what happened in Detroit. The whole blocks were burnt to the ground. 40 people were killed by the police. These were huge urban insurrections, and the backbone of those, leading lots of those battles, often against, often battles which are triggered by police brutality, were the brothers on the block. And they developed a theory around what they call the lumpen proletariat, which is a phrase that Karl Marx used to describe people who had dropped out of the working class. That's say they were no longer part of organized labor, but more than that, they were kind of lechers. They were people that were parasitic on working class people. Not for any fault of their own particularly, but you get people, a minority gets so crushed by the system they can't get a job, they live on the edge, they might be involved in petty crime or whatever it is, but they're not integrated into the world of work or trying to get work. They're all living on the outside and end up committing crimes against our side very often because of where people live and where, what access they have to committing crimes. So those sorts of people they saw as the backbone of the revolutionary potential of the working class as they saw it. So that was their kind of Marxism, very, very different to where we're coming from, and because of that, it created problems. But at its outset, actually, it looked like a way to win, and they weren't, as I say, they weren't different to anyone else in that view. It was common amongst the students in Paris to new groups of industrial workers, even in the big capitalist centres of the world. Okay, and so but the strategy of patrolling the pigs, as they called it, patrolling the police, was necessarily confrontational. Although they weren't preaching to have an armed struggle with the police, it was necessarily confrontational to the state. It was throwing down a gauntlet to the state, saying, we are watching you and we have our shotguns. Can the state just sit back and say, okay, that's fine, you carry on? No, they obviously said, hey, these people are very, very dangerous. We're going to have to start dealing with this. But anyway, as I say, the Panthers went viral when they did that march up onto the steps of California State Capitol. And very quickly, they're setting up chapters, as they call them, branches, all over the country. But it's important to say, one poll had it something like 75% of the black population of America supported the Black Panther Party. And let's remind ourselves, these were revolutionary socialists that wanted to overthrow the state and smash capitalism. They had the support of the overwhelming majority of black people in America. That was really worrying the FBI, which is why Edgar J. Hoover, the head of the FBI, described the Black Panther Party as the biggest internal threat to the security of the United States of America. And that's incredible, given that at their height, the Black Panther Party only had about 5,000 members. That's to say, roughly the same size as the Socialist Workers' Party in this country. You can do a lot of shit with a few thousand people. A minority can turn other cogs, which can turn other cogs and can have a big influence, providing you have right politics to relate to people and to relate to struggles and to lead struggles. And that's what the Panthers did, and they got people behind them, but they appeared, as someone put it, inside the community as if they were superheroes. Yeah, the Panthers are wonderful. Yes, we passively support the Black Panther Party, but they're too hot to handle. We don't want to get too close to the Black Panther Party because we can see what's coming down, which is the police are going to come for them. The state is going to come for them, and this could get dangerous. And indeed, that is what happens. On the other side of the Black Panther strategy, though, on one hand, there was the patrolling the pigs, which necessarily, because of what that said, what that was about, went in a revolutionary direction. They also took another thing from Maoism, which is if you're going to build a peasant army, which the Chinese middle class, well, they call themselves the Communist Party, but the real Communist Party had been destroyed in the 1920s. That's another story. But anyway, you're going to lead the struggle. You're going to base it on the peasantry, but you have to be nice to the peasantry. You can't go around stealing their food or telling them what to do. You have to serve the people. So they took that motto on hand. The Black Panther Party said, yes, that's an important thing we need to do, serve the people, to build support in the community. And one of the key ways in which they would serve the people, in addition to being pioneers in health services, in education that we're talking about today, in terms of decolonizing the education curriculum, the Panthers started all of those sorts of things, and others before them, to be honest. But things like sickle cell, they were definitely pioneers in setting up clinics in the black community on that subject. And most importantly, or most famously, the Breakfast for Children program, which the Black Panther Party set up, which, as it said, provided tens of thousands of breakfasts for near-starving children in the ghettos that had nothing to eat in the morning, the most important meal of the day. That was very good work, and that did build them support, but also took them in a slightly different direction to the revolution that they had preached, because it meant that they had to go and find the food to feed the kids. They had the personnel to do the dishing out the meals, but to get the money in, to get the food, meant relating to black capital. And the only place where there was any black capital was really the churches. and other small businesses, so you needed to get donations in. So that took them in a totally different direction, what you might call a more reformist direction. And as revolutionaries, we argue, well, we don't think reforms in themselves are going to get rid of racism or overthrow capitalism, but actually we don't abstain on the issue. We're in favour of reforms that make a difference to people's lives. But it's just to say that there's a tension in that strategy. One's going in one direction, the other's going in another more reformist direction. So that became a problem. And the fact, added to that, the fact that they were based, theoretically at least, and in practice to a large extent also, amongst the semi-unemployed youth. And it wasn't just brothers, it was sisters too. But that had its own problems. So the Black Panther Party had rules, for example, because instead of discipline coming from political understanding, obviously the main form of discipline, it's the same as in the SWP, we didn't have anyone telling anyone what to do. It's because actually you're convinced of the ideas, generally speaking, while you're in the Socialist Workers' Party and while you do stuff. That comes from an appreciation of how the world works and how you think you can change it. But also we have to kind of work together and work as one and agree to be muted in this meeting all at the same time. You've got to have some kind of discipline. The Panthers found that increasingly difficult to maintain. And their party branches, their chapters, were at different levels. Some were more advanced politically, some were more backward. Some were people who were just attracted to the guns, others were generally attracted to Marxism. So they had things like Marxism reading groups where people read stuff you wouldn't read, but Franz Fanon actually was good to read. Mao Zedong, not so good. But anyway, and Karl Marx and others, and Lenin, State and Revolution, all of these things. And they had rules where a party member had to read so many hours a day. We don't have those kind of rules. It's not. That kind of discipline comes through being wanting to change the world. But they were forced to introduce those sorts of rules in order to try to fashion an organisation that had some kind of discipline formation, move together, and you could send instructions and get people to do the same thing at the same time. Had other interesting rules like not being high whilst you're carrying your weapon, which sounds like a very good rule, so people don't get shot accidentally. But the fact that they had to have those rules is an issue. The tension between reform and revolution, you see it in a 10-point programme that they had, quite a famous programme which had really good things about not joining the army and so forth. But it had other stuff about how we want to be United Nations to institute a plebiscite inside the United States to deliver black liberation, which was pie in the sky, because the United Nations is made up of the ruling classes of all the different other capitalist countries, big and small. So, and that wasn't necessarily going to help. Okay, I'm running a bit short of time. So, so those were some of the problems that their strategy entailed. But nevertheless, very quickly they started to get traction. And they didn't just stop at the black community. So when Huey Newton was framed by the police, one of the founders of the party in California, there's a huge campaign called Free Huey campaign, which again kind of went viral. The great and the good of Hollywood, from Marlon Brando to Jane Fonda, were supporters of the campaign. It had genuine mass support across the country. And the Panthers themselves deliberately, as a matter of following through on their ideology of anti-capitalism, although they didn't allow white people in the organisation, they understood the need to have white allies. So their best elements put that into practice, their best leaders. People like Fred Hampton, who was headed up the Chicago chapter and was murdered by the police, assassinated by the police. He led outreach activity to places such as the Appalachian Mountains, where white miners lived. Miners who had a huge tradition, actually, of fighting the state and the coal miners. Matewan, people should look up. These are real serious, ferocious class battles. They understood the nature of the capitalist state, but they didn't necessarily understand the nature of the need to fight racism and have class unity. Fred Hampton went up there to talk about the need for that unity and to overcome racism, and through overcoming racism, we make our side stronger. It's in your interest as white people to do that. and it got a hearing. And that was what really, really scared the ruling class, that possibility of black and white, the best elements on both sides coming together to understand how our power as one is the way in which we can actually upend their system. But the police did come for them. They infiltrated their organisation. They set up a counter-intelligence program, the FBI, that was in particular, but working with the police, which massively infiltrated the organisation, sent guns into some of the chapters deliberately in order to start fights with the police. There's huge shootouts, people got killed, increasing tensions inside the organisation as a result. People were forced into exile, like Eldridge Cleaver, forced to Algeria. People like Newton, who ended up in China briefly, where he did huge rallies at the airport. I think there's some good, amazing footage of that, whatever you think about what's going on in China. Yeah, so they had great support, but they had the state come down on their heads like a ton of bricks. Could it have ended differently? Well, most definitely could have done. Just very quickly, when the state came for them, they had no way of defending themselves. But with a slightly different radically different strategy, it could have been, I would argue, a different story. So, but there are reasons for that. So let's have a quickly look at that for 2 minutes. They could have organised strikes to defend themselves. But how could you do that if you don't have any workers, any members in the car plants or in the factories, or in the hospitals, on the buses and so on? Or maybe you do, but you don't see that as a place where you organise. And the truth is, by the time the Panthers were crushed by the state in the late 60s or early 70s, that was precisely the time when there was an upsurge in strikes, especially in the auto plants, the car plants in places like Detroit, because the Republicans and people like Nixon had a deliberate strategy of what they call getting the black people off the streets and into the suites, by which they meant the hotel suites, by giving the black middle class something, giving them a stake, and also giving jobs to black working class youth, which is what happened in terms of the car plants. Hundreds and thousands went into car plants. And in there, they took that radical politics with them. They had organizations like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which set up Marxist reading circles inside Ford, inside Chrysler, inside General Motors plants in Detroit. This is quite incredible. There's been even people from those organizations that came over to the UK and spoke at our meetings of the International Socialist, the forerunners of the SWP, where we had, in those days, we had branches of the Socialist Workers' Party, or our forerunners, inside car plants and inside factories. And we organised meetings with black workers who'd come in to talk about their experience in America. That was beginning. You could see, if the Panthers were still around then, how there could have been another way in terms of actually when the state came for them, you could have paralysed the car industry and cost them $50 million a day or whatever. You know, that's the way you could see in which they could actually strike back with an alternative power centre to confront the state. Also, the way they organised, they were a black organisation, and as I said, they deliberately went out to search for white allies. Some of those allies weren't necessarily very good picks, such as the Yippies, which was the political wing of the hippie movement, the White Panther Party, which were basically white liberals who were based and critical of anything but black people did. But nevertheless, they were genuine people, and nevertheless, they were allies. But what would have been better would to have a multiracial party. But that tradition had been disrupted, and the continuity had been broken. So, because there was a party that did preach racial unity, was consistently anti-racist in the way up until its existence. I'm talking about American Communist Party. Prior to that, the American Socialist Party actually went along with racism, had meetings with black people in one room and white workers in another room. That isn't the Socialist Party worth its salt. And that was a big problem inside the American working class that we're still living with today, but I'll say things have improved radically. So that tradition of the Communist Party, especially in the 1930s, when they had a big black membership, they had 1,000 black members in Harlem, they attracted people like Robeson and others. Paul Robeson, famously, to the party. Things led to campaigns like the Scottsboro Boys. That showed a different way in which you could build a multiracial party of equals, of fighters, where the white people see it as their duty to be the leaders in the fight against racism, not something you leave to black people and the black community to do, which was a tendency amongst people of the time. You saw it in terms of, the white people do the revolution for their people and we'll do the revolution for the black people. It would have been more effective to actually have a united multiracial revolutionary socialist party as the type we're trying to build here today, or the type they built in Russia with the Bolsheviks, which united the Jewish people and the Jewish Russians and so-called native Russians. In other words, within its own self, it was actually an example of how racism is overcome. And they could have led struggles on that basis. Okay. So to finish, the movement is rising again. The Panthers was the high point, I would say, of the movement of the 1960s. It ended in defeat, sadly. So all of those battles where people fought together and came together and learned off each other, how the National Liberation Front of the Vietnamese people that destroyed the American army in Vietnam was taken as inspiration by the Gay Liberation Front, who borrowed the same title for their organisation for gay liberation. How the women's movement drew inspiration from the struggle for black liberation, and that created the women's liberation movement, or the rebirth of the women's liberation movement. So all of the different oppressed groups started to learn from each other, and there's the idea of a revolution in all of the different ways that might come about and how it might look, but a revolution which would solve all of the problems by a united struggle against this capitalist system. So there was that kind of overarching unity to things, but as soon as those struggles started to break down, we ended up with identity politics. Instead of so the most important thing was not being a socialist or not being a Black Panther, but it became being my oppression, being a black gay woman, for example. So identity politics takes the head, and that's where we kind of got to today. But where we are today is actually, I would argue, in advance of where we ended up in the 60s and the 70s. Just very quickly, the Black Lives Matter movement, although formerly those sorts of politics of identity politics of talking about white supremacy, unconscious bias, privilege theory, which fundamentally argues that it's in the interest of white people to be racist, because they have this privilege, which is a good description of an unequal society, but in terms of actually advancing the struggle against it, has issues, I would say. But despite those formal common sense of the system, in terms of how people describe oppression, the actual movement itself is showing in practice how black and white can unite and fight. It's not just an abstract slogan that these socialists talk about, but in America, actually, it's finding whole states where actually the majority of people doing the fighting against racism are white people. In Portland, well, sadly, someone from the NAACP's criticised people, but actually, most of it's a pretty white city, and they've been having a pitched battle for 60 odd days, solid, because of George Floyd's murder and the struggle they took up in solidarity with George Floyd. That's been repeated, not at the same pitch, but across the country. What the New York Times describes as possibly the biggest ever protest movement in the history of the United States of America. Just last week, or the week before now, there was a strike for Black Lives, which saw organised labour taking up the issue of racism and putting it centre stage in a way it hasn't been put before for so a long time inside the American working class. It was a minority of organised labour, but it was still a big minority of hundreds of thousands of people around the country that walked out or came out at lunchtime or had a protest or something more than that, stretching from the Teamsters to the dockers, to the nurses, to teachers, to UPS delivery workers. That is a wide spectrum of different people from across a multiracial Latino, Black and white working class acting together against racial oppression. So I'll finish it there because I think that is the living legacy of the Black Panther Party. They fought the state, but the state did win, but it doesn't actually destroy the movement to get rid of racism in America or anywhere else. And so we'll take forward the example of the Black Panther Party, and I think the most important thing, which is the mass movement and the struggle from below, which is where the Black Panthers came from. There's still Panthers in prison to this day, we will eventually get them out, but to do so, I think will require a revolution. But we're not the only ones preaching revolution. When 25% of Americans say they're in favour of defunding of the police, which is a pretty radical lefty demand, things are moving. And so we could well be moving to another period in which the idea of revolution doesn't seem so crazy anymore. And that revolutionary struggle is a way to get rid of racism, because it was capitalism that invented racism.
That's fantastic, Gary. Thank you very much. It was very informative. Folks, if you want to contribute, we prefer people to keep their contributions to around 3 minutes if possible. If you have a look along the bottom of the screen, there's some little icons. One of the icons says participants. If you click on that icon, a box will open to your right, and there are buttons in that box, and one of the buttons says raise hand. So if you want to contribute, if you use the button to raise your hand, I will call you all in order to make a contribution. Okay, the first person with their hand up is Thomas. So if you want to come in, that'd be lovely, Thomas.
Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, brilliant meeting. I mean, something that goes around in my head a lot is about, I don't know, just kind of, do you think new technologies in, I don't know, warfare would create, I don't know, just new kind of forms of barbarism to assassinate political opponents in the US? Because, I mean, I read an article about just how difficult it was to take out drones with, I don't know, kind of bombs attached to them. You know, how hard it was for anti-ISIS fighters to take them out. And this is, you know, the most arid desert environment, and something in a city, it's going to be impossible to do something like that. And yeah, it has me worried. What are future political assassinations going to be like in the US?
Would anyone else like to put their hand up? Don't feel nervous about contributing. You can contribute about something you've read or ask questions, but please feel free to make a contribution. I've not got any hands up at the moment, so, you know, feel free to stick your hand up. I'm just waiting for you. Mark, your hand is up. Do you want to wade in? Thank you.
Just a minute. Can you hear me? Yeah, no, Gary answered all my questions in his talk, actually, because I wanted to talk about Angela Davis, who's a member of the Communist Party, I think, because we did a meeting on her a couple of weeks ago. And it was just a shame that they never got to work together, even though Angela Davis probably supported most of the Black Panthers' demands. Could just sort of give us a quick difference on why, you know, just the slight difference between Angela Davis's position. And I know you couldn't be a member of the Communist Party and be a member of the Black Panthers and stuff like that. And sometimes I think the rules went against them, you know what I mean? And did they ever think about the Trotsky's position on the United Front? That was in the 1960s particularly, because the people in Portland seem to get it now, don't they? You know, I think it's very hard now to become a sectarian, a separatist more, should I say, because the black community must be seeing all these white people in Portland going out and supporting Black Lives Matter. That must dilute that need to be separatist, to build a separatist movement. When you have that sort of about 70% of people in Portland, white citizens fighting for Black Lives Matter, not only fighting for it, but fighting against the police and being brutalised by the police. I don't think you would have seen that in the late 60s, particularly in Detroit, Chicago, and places like that. It'd have been quite the opposite, you know what I mean? So I think it's shifted. But I would be interested in just a bit more elaborating on United Front theory of the Black Panther. What I know you did talk about it in the meeting, because they sort of work with the White Panther Party and stuff like that. But just a bit more, you know, the need for a united front. I'll leave it there.
That's excellent. Thanks, Mark. And I've got Dave A next, and no one after that. So please feel free to put your hand up, contribute, ask a question, whatever you like.
Yeah, just a couple of points on what Tom was saying. I think the situation with assassinations in the US at the moment is probably a little unlikely, because there don't seem to be those outstanding leaders that we saw coming out of the 60s, the Malcolm X's, the Martin Luther Kings, the Bobby Seals, the Fred Hamptons, those kind of people who were actually making serious headway as political leaders. But it's a fair point to make that what the military uses in war at one stage will be used on the civilian population at a later stage. And in particular, I'm thinking of what's been happening in Portland, because those of you who've read about the Vietnam War or were alive to have seen it on the telly and all the rest of it will know that the use of chemical warfare in Vietnam was quite appalling. Agent Orange was used allegedly as a defoliant to basically a weed killer, to make it so that guerrillas couldn't move through the jungle, that kind of thing. But it also had quite appalling side effects on the population of Vietnam, on the effects on fetuses and children born with deformities, all related to that. And what we've seen in Portland is 60 days now of people being tear gassed, people being pepper sprayed, people being hit with CS gas and other gases which, aren't generally known about. And you are starting to hear from Portland reports of people who are having quite serious health effects from having gone out on those demonstrations. So it's not unreasonable to believe that, what's used in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, will sooner or later be used on civilian populations at home. And the other thing I wanted to say was to draw a kind of parallel between those ideas of the Black Panthers, those Maoist ideas of creating revolutionary bases, and the civil rights movement in Ireland, and how the people in Derry stood up against the Northern Irish police and the British Army by creating Free Derry, a no-go area in a major metropolitan district in the UK. So, these things are possible. These things feed over from one area to another. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That's brilliant, Dave. Thank you. I've got Mick next, and then Tony, you put your hand up. So after Mick, then Tony, and then I've not got anyone else with their hand up. So please, as I say, feel free to make a contribution. Thanks, Mick.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. Excellent meeting from Gary. Interesting stuff. Yeah, I looked a little bit, reading a little bit about Angela Davis as well, actually. She did say something about how we have to be careful. Like in the time of the Black Panthers, there was some people wanted to have a revolution, an armed revolution, and others, there was disagreements within the party, I think. They were doing lots of breakfast clubs for the kids and stuff, and made it a community. So it's a local kind of thing, which was important. But someone were accused of being like social workers, and some wanted a more radical, more extreme, violent overthrow. And I guess there was separatism as well. And as we see in Portland now, there was arguments at the time for a kind of more inclusive attitude. Angela Davis made a good point. She did an interview, I think it was just about 2000s, but she was saying at the time, globalization really has devastated the working class, the white working class communities. When I say white working class communities, I mean, what usually happens in these communities is that the black working class are within those communities too, and they've been, every time white working class people were affected by globalization, the blacks segment was hit twice as badly. And so I guess really one of the issues now would be like globalization, and in terms like if white unskilled workers like myself say lost jobs, then obviously it was worse for black people. Another thing as well is that she did say as well, like there is a black bourgeoisie, and we have to be careful about having this kind of thing like saying white black. I mean, it's a class thing. Obviously a lot of black people bought into the kind of system. They've managed to get an education and certain advantages, which like the whites do when it becomes on the middle class. But yeah, I think at the time one of the guys that I think would have been a great influence would have been Fred Hampton. Unfortunately, he was killed. I think Hoover and the rest of them, because he was trying to join up with Luther King. So Luther King had actually, before he died, he's going to have a change of mission. He'd just been on with a sanitation strike in some place where he got killed, and he was supporting the union there in the strike. And so it was like a meeting between the unions and Martin Luther King and stuff like that. And Hampton wanted to get involved with that too. So there was a big debate going on the Black Panthers at that pretty time. But unfortunately, Fred Hampton was murdered by police in his own home. So yeah, I've gone on a bit there, but anyway, anything that Gary's got to say about all that sort of stuff would be interesting. Cheers.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mick. Then Tony is next, and I haven't got anyone else with their hand up. Pearl, or it'd probably be Andy. Tony, come on. Tony, you need to unmute. I've tried to unmute you, but we can't hear you. That's it. Lovely. Start again. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I'm in a bit of a crossroads with all what's going on and this whole thing between blacks and whites. I mean, what is the problem between? I mean, I know in general, 99.9% of black and white people get on, but with the powers that may be, what is the issue between blacks and them? I mean, is it a wealth? Is it over land? Is it over minerals? It surely can't be over the color of your skin. So is it over past achievements from ancient times? Things like pyramids building, and is it a thing where the powers that may be is kind of probably frightened that black people will rise and I don't know, turn everything around if they are given the capacity to be as an equal and develop within themselves and their minds and whatever else. So you know, I just cannot understand what the issue is and why it's just mayhem, really, because everywhere you look you just see issues going on, and it's just down to race, different type of race, and blacks and whites. Well, not blacks and whites, but blacks and the regime. I'm out.
Thanks, Tony. Next, it will be Pearl or Andy. So, and I haven't got any hands up after that, so please put your hands up and contribute. Thank you, folks.
Okay, I just want to ask Gary a question. I saw some video of a march in Brixton on Saturday or Sunday where people were drilled. Black people were drilling and sort of marching and in a military kind of fashion, very reminiscent of the Black Panthers, and I'm sure very much influenced by them. It seemed to be, from what I could tell from the flags, a group that would call themselves Forever Friends, but I might have got that wrong. That's either the name, that's either a slogan or or the name of the group. I'm not sure if Gary can shed a bit of light on that, because that is a kind of interesting development in the way that the Black Lives Matter movement has got, where the Black Lives Matter movement has got to at the moment. I just wanted to try and answer Tony's question. It's obviously a very big question. Where does racism come from, essentially? I think I'll just try and sum it up as that. In the modern era, in the last 300-400 years, racism has been developed and invented, like modern racism, pseudo-scientific racism, as we call it, in order to justify initially slavery. If you're going to exploit people, treat them as property, buy and sell them, tear families apart, exploit them to life expectancy in fields was 6 or 7 years in the West Indies. The most appalling cruelty and bestiality from the overseers and the planters and so forth. And you had to justify that, you know, in political terms, in scientific terms, and in religious terms. So there was a whole history of pseudo-scientific racist ideas published and presented and promoted in this country, and on almost certainly probably in France and in America as well. I think before that, racism was very different. It wasn't about exploitation of black people. It was sometimes just a fear of difference and so forth. I'm just going to promote what we've done with it. Where's the book? I'm just going to promote this book. I hope it's probably coming out the wrong way around because I've got my camera, but Stay in Power by Peter Fryer. This book is an absolute goldmine of history. It's about the history of black people in Britain, people like Ottobah Cugoano. I'll put it in the chat. So people can pick it up. If you can get hold of that, or beg, borrow or steal it, and I'm quite happy to lend mine when I've finished it, as long as you give it back, because it is an absolutely great book. We need to learn this history. It's been said on a number of Black Lives Matter protests in Coventry, and it will almost certainly be said on Saturday in the protest organised by Revolution West Midlands. We've got to study our history, and I think I've read a lot. And I did read that book a long time ago, and I've come back to reread it now, and it's an absolute treasure, because it does explain the resistance, the political ideas, the civilization, the attempts to organise Pan-Africanism and everything else, and also the pseudo-scientific racism, and the marvellous, rich history of resistance to racism in this country. Mainly from black people, but obviously, lots of examples of support from the white section of the population as well. Another great book is Burying the Chains by Thomas Clarkson, which is a specific history of how the slave trade was abolished. And I'll put that in the chat as well, because I haven't got a copy of that, unfortunately, to lend to anybody, because I lent it a long time ago. It was in prison and we couldn't get it back. But yeah, it's essentially to just justify economic exploitation. There's no point in having racism if it doesn't serve a purpose to the ruling class. It was invented and promoted and spread around because it was useful to the ruling class. The ideas of a society, the ideas of the ruling class, and that is the ideas that we have. And there's a long history of resistance, and we're still today breaking it down. I was very privileged today to be in Bristol. My niece lives in Bristol. I've just come back from there, and I just went to the Plinth, where the ex-statue of Edward Colston is, and it's obviously a bit of a tourist attraction in Bristol. And it's only a symbolic thing, but I think it's been quite good to provide a focus and an expression of the power of our movement and the anger that exists about discrimination and oppression that still goes on in British society now.
Excellent, thanks, Andy. I have got Patricia next, if you want to wade in, and I don't have anyone after that. Please, if you've never spoken before, don't be shy. Put your hand up, we'd love to hear from you. Come on, Trish.
Hi, hi everybody. Thank you very much, Gary, for that really comprehensive talk. I saw a programme recently about the Black Panthers as well, and there was also something on at the university, Warwick University, about a year or so ago. I was thinking about what they did, how this fits in. I know people thought it was a softer thing to do, to cater for things like the Breakfast Club, to look at the whole person. But I wondered if that threatened and made people think quite a lot more as well about the injustice. The sickle cell research and development of clinics was fantastic. But the way that really the inadequacies of the system was exposed because of the other things that the Black Panthers did. And I know Hamas does things like this as well. They help and they perform an almost kind of, people don't generally know, but almost a social work type capacity. They also help when people are killed. You know, they help people, the relatives, etc. So yeah, that's something that I didn't know about when I found out about them. I thought that was interesting. What do you think that the real thing was that caused them to be assassinated? Was it the acknowledgement of a large angry section of the community that could potentially threaten capitalism? What do you think it was that meant that they were assassinated? Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. I think Hezbollah run big clinics all over Lebanon, and
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, healthcare clinics, social work, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just make you wonder what they're able to do about the current really horrific crisis in Lebanon at the moment. I hope. I haven't got any other hands up. Please, excuse me. Please put your hands up. Feel free to contribute. If I don't get any hands up in a second, I will bring Gary back in to sum up if no one's going to put their hand up. Anyone going to put their hand up? No, I am going to bring Gary back in, if that's all right, Gary.
Yes, so I just unmuted. Yeah, great discussion. Yeah, okay, well, I'll begin with Patricia. I think you're right that the Breakfast for Children programme exposed the state, as did the other programmes that they operated. It emphasised to the community that there was this gaping hole in terms of provision. And that could be said for quite a lot of people in America, one of the richest countries in the world with highest levels of poverty, and that's still the case to this day. So yeah, that kind of work was important in that sense, but and it's also important in the practical sense of actually feeding people, although, you know, it was, compared to the size of the Black population, it was still small, but it was an initiative that people knew about, and for those that received the meals, I'm sure it made a difference. But I think the fundamental reason why they came for the Panthers and why the state and the capitalists saw them as a threat is because they were anti-capitalist. And they threatened to actually organically connect the fight with racism against a wider fight against the capitalist system, which meant that they had a possibility then of actually winning allies, of spreading the struggle. And that's the way that racism has been kept going, by forcing the divide and rule approach. And the whole history of the USA is about the need to block struggles and stop struggles by using racism, be it I don't know if anyone's seen The Killing Floor. It was a film made with union money, I think, about the Chicago packing plants, one of Denzel Washington's first films, and how they used Black migrants from the Deep South who got out of the terrorism of the South and went up to a place like Chicago to get away from that and to hopefully get a job. But they got, some of them got picked up by the capitalists to come and break strikes in the meat packing plants, to sow the seeds of racial hatred anew. And a minority on both sides could see what the capitalists were doing, and it's about that strike and about those sorts of struggles. But that's been there for a long time. We saw it in the history of America after the Civil War. Well, the Civil War itself actually was a huge breakthrough and victory for black people, but in which black people played a key role in their own liberation with the shock troops of the Union Army in the South. But it took them a very long time to destroy those gains. There's not much talked about, but the war ends in 1965, 2 years of mayhem, where the old ruling class, the plantocracy, tries to come back. The North eventually says, no, we've had enough of this, and they impose a dictatorship, inverted commas, with black people and their white Republican allies in charge, and they called it Reconstruction. And that lasted for about 10 years, and that's when the first black people were elected to Congress and so on. Didn't mean all the white people came over to support the black people, but a minority did. And it took them a while to turn that back and destroy that movement. Time to go into that, but it ended with populism in the 1880s, so it was still there, the idea of a possibility of some black and white unity to make real social gains. And that's where Jim Crow came from. They had to have Jim Crow because they was the ruling class, which had been sort of reconstituted. It was the old plantocracy had been kind of crushed, but there was a new South that rose, which had a merchant class and so on. And those people saw that actually to maintain their power, they needed to try and reinforce racism. So they introduced things like the poll tax to stop black people voting, but the conscious white people, a minority, realised that actually if there's a poll tax, which means you have to have a certain amount of money to vote, a certain amount of property, it means a lot of white people aren't going to get to vote. And so that's what happened. To stop black people getting education, they stopped the idea of free public education in the South, which stopped black people getting educated, but also stopped lots of white working class people getting educated. So actually, they were well aware of what they were doing, and they didn't give the white people any benefit out of that other than the psychological wage, as the great black intellectual and a Marxist for a bit of his time, W.E.B. Du Bois, described it, a psychological wage. So although you're living in rubbish, although you're poor white, you have nothing, you have white skin, so you're not the one that's going to get killed by the Ku Klux Klan. And that was the psychological wage. So that's the roots also of how racism keeps regenerating in places like America, but today it's rooted not so much in slavery, thankfully, but it's still rooted in the inequalities of capitalist society and the dog-eat-dog nature of capitalist society. To answer Tony's question, where does this racism come from? Why does it keep regenerating? It came from, as a comrade has already explained, in terms of the roots of capitalism. It wasn't a little thing on the side, it's embedded into how capitalism got going. By literally what we mean is slavery. Without slavery and the money that brought together, they wouldn't have had the seed capital to create the Industrial Revolution. And it was the Industrial Revolution that delivered the British Empire. It's the British Empire that made Britain the preeminent capitalist country in the world until it was overtaken by the United States. And those are the roots of racism. And they had to have racism to justify all of those things, to justify slavery. When they changed it with empire, they're not so much that you're subhuman anymore, now you're just little children. But they changed it again, well, actually now you're equal, you can come to the mother country and work, blah, blah. But then there's a whole thing about immigration, which is basically fundamentally a battle inside the working class over crumbs from their table, who gets what in the labour market, trying to get us to fight each other. And when things are bad, people are more open to blaming someone next to them. That's the roots of the racism and how it regenerates at the moment. And fundamental to all about how racism got going, just quickly, it's worth saying, it's very important to understand, well, wasn't there racism before that? Well, no, there wasn't. Racism is a new category specific to capitalism. Prior to that, yes, you had xenophobia. Prior to that, yes, peasants lived in one little part of England or Ghana, and didn't travel very far. So anyone from outside of their immediate family was a foreigner. So they might have had some kind of prejudices against foreigners. But the idea of racism to say that, and they might have had slavery, unfree labour of different sorts, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe, who were slaves inside the caliphates, various caliphates. But it wasn't racialized, that's the difference. The Greeks and the Romans in the ancient world had slavery. And they took it as natural. They didn't need to invent an ideology to explain it. And the slaves came in all different colors. And the ruling class came in all different colors. But it wasn't based on this racism. That racism came out of the idea of this new sort of society that said, we're all equal. This new capitalist society of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, which gave rise to the great slave rebellion and revolution led by Toussaint Louverture, because the slaves heard about this thing about freedom, so it can get out of control for the capitalists. But when they talk about freedom, they just meant freedom for the merchants and for the men merchants. It didn't mean freedom for the working class or for black people or for women. But anyway, some people took it literally. And so if you're going to talk about freedom for all equal under the law, and you're enslaving all these Africans, you've got to come up with some kind of way of justifying that. And that's what racism was. It took a while to get it together, but that's where it came from. So we've got to get rid of that system in order to have a chance of getting rid of racism. And through getting rid of that system, we challenge the ideas in people's heads. And those white people are still allied to those ideas. The reason why the poor whites are so poor in the southern states is because of their racism. It makes it easier for the capitalists to make money out of them. But things are moving ahead in the States, so that's just quite interesting fashions. I'm going on too long. Angela Davis, yeah, really brilliant class fighter, someone who's kept the flame of united struggles alive when all of this identity politics started to come out of defeats. She kept to the idea of actually the importance of race and class, how the two things go together. And if you want a real struggle that's going to actually advance the fight against racism, it has to be connected to a wider struggle to get rid of capitalism. She stuck to that idea. You know, in the early 70s, the FBI put out posters saying "armed and dangerous," wanted posters for Angela Davis, because she was a philosophy professor at the University of California, but I didn't defend her because she was too outspoken. She talked about she was a leader of Soledad Defense Committee, a man called George Jackson, who went to prison for stealing $70 and actually ended up in prison for years, was on solitary confinement for 7 years, and eventually was murdered in prison during a riot. There's a big, huge campaign after that. She was involved in that. In terms of, and she was, as you're right, she was also a member of the Communist Party. She had dual membership, and it's worth saying, because I didn't say it in the main talk, but actually, far from the image sometimes portrayed of the Black Panthers, but there are lots of gun-toting men. Actually, the majority membership of the Black Panther Party was actually women. Some of the key leaders of the Black Panther Party were women. The last leader, Elaine Brown, was a woman, as you can tell from her name. The other key leaders like Kathleen Cleaver, one another great leader, and of course Angela Davis herself. Tupac, you know, the rapper who died, used to wear his t-shirts, but his mother was a leading member in New York of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So those are kind of ideas they lived on, and it's important to the state that women were key, because actually that tradition is still here. The founders of Black Lives Matter movement in the United States are all women, 3 women. That's an important part of the struggle. We shouldn't forget. Yeah, the thing about Portland repression has been horrific. I mean, it really is. You know, it's a militarized police force and a militarized federal agencies, because it's the patrol, it's the border patrol and the ICE people and the immigration control authority who are doing this huge repression. And those are kind of entities that are meant to protect the American people, supposedly at the borders, but they're using them blatantly inside the big cities to clamp down on our struggles in a vile way. And that's opening up all sorts of opportunities and potential for the anti-racist movement because of the nature of that repression. The first question, I think Tom asked about political assassinations, but basically they've got lots more ways to kill us, which is true, but these things are always a balance of power. So when our struggle is moving forward, it's hard for them to move against us. They didn't move against the Panthers all at once. It was when they started to fracture, but they were able to step up the levels of repression. Yes, and the tensions inside the organisation, how people react to that state repression is important. I'll probably finish here is, you know, so is this what happened in the Panthers also? How do you react to the state repression? And they weren't an organisation that was around long enough to develop strategy and tactics, when knowing when to go keep on advancing or when to pull back. You know, and something that we've been practiced in doing in Britain, because we've had quite a lot of defeats, and you have to know when actually trying to get the mass strike going again after the miners' strike and we got defeated. You know when you've got to pull back and to kind of recuperate. But in the Panther Party, that argument, people were trying to have that argument whilst the state is coming for them. It was very difficult. So some people went in the direction of actually, if they want to kill us, let's kill them. So Cleaver. Cleaver was, he founded something called the Black Liberation Army, which did go down that route. And he was accused by Huey Newton of adventurism. I think Huey Newton's absolutely right, because fundamentally they've got more guns than we've got, so we're never going to win that way. So in '68 they launched attacks on the police when Martin Luther King was killed. Bobby Hutton got killed. That led to more ructions inside the party and more splits. But that example, sadly, was copied by others who saw it as an answer to state repression. I say the answer to the Portland state repression is a general strike in Portland. That's how we stop them. Others saw it in terms of like the student movement in the West, in Germany. If anyone's seen a film called The Bader-Meinhof Complex, it's a very good film because it shows where the idea of the terrorism came from. So it starts off with all the police violence, and people had enough of the police violence and the people getting shot in the head by the right wing and stuff, and said, no, we've got to fight back. But they did it through terrorism. And because they went to terrorism, it gave the state a massive impetus to use repression against our side. So today, everyone in Germany has to have a, passport carried around with them and stuff, everything's on fire, blah, blah, blah. That was all as a result of fighting Red Terror in Germany. And that was the wrong way to go, and actually led to the breaking of the radical left in places like Germany, in places like Italy, where we had parties of 30,000 radio stations and stuff, big implantation inside the working class in Italy, but it was broken because of red brigades going towards terrorism. So that's not an answer, it's not a solution. It's another form of elitism, the idea of a bunch of people doing it for us. Actually, we're about all of us doing it for ourselves. The emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, and the same for the struggle against racism. The struggle will be led by black people, but with white allies, with black generals, as the riots were described in 1981 in Marseille by The Guardian. That's how the revolution will look. So yeah, all power to the Panther Party, and let's take their struggle forward by building a revolutionary socialist party in this country. A party that is rooted in the traditions of the best traditions of the working class in this country. The leaders of the fight against slavery were in the Caribbean and were in the English working class of the cotton mills, who sided with the Union Army against the Civil War, despite the fact that the cotton was coming from the South. They knew who the real enemy was, which was the capitalists at home and the slavers abroad. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I hope I covered everything.